Okay, great. Good evening, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us. This is actually, I think, really the last seminar of the 2021 cycle. But South Africans are essentially useless in December and can't be persuaded to do anything that looks like work. We really believe in taking a protracted summer holiday. So this is in that sense, this should have probably happened at the end of November or the beginning of December, but we're doing it at the beginning of the 2022 academic cycle, and all sitting here hoping to God, that this is where this thing is going to turn. There's a horrible piece, you will have seen it, I'm sure, in the New York Times yesterday morning saying, beware optimism history. It said that that's what happened last time, and we'll see more trouble from the virus in the year ahead of us. But let's just pause for a moment and think about where we are. And we have two really wonderful books and three authors here. So Adam is well known. We coerced him, tricked him into doing about 6 of these presentations over the last 18 months or so. And we read Crashed and then discussed it at length. And we read several of his other books actually as well. So he doesn't really need an introduction. He's a professor of history at Columbia. Simon Szreter is a professor of history and public and policy at Cambridge. And Hilary Cooper is an economist and a former government economist. So we can hold her responsible for all the terrible things she says about the British state in this wonderful book. So these are both really smoothly written, easily read books with in each case a kind of edge, a quite worrying edge, a pessimistic view, I think, about where the world is going. So thank you, all three of you, very much for that. And what we're going to do is we're going to post a series of questions. Now, brilliantly hidden, the one I wanted to. Each of the members of the seminar that reads these books together has put together a question, and the questions are actually on the Wiser website. So I'll post a link to them so you can see a more protracted run of show, basically, where we explain a little bit about what each of the questions has in mind. But if we were to read the questions in detail, we'd be here all night. So I'll post that link. People can see it. There we go. So, right, so to get going, having just posted a link to that page, I wanted to post a link to another one, which is a link on the Economist website, which is a link of excess deaths measuring the countries, which gives us a really useful, I think, way of comparing how the pandemic has played out globally. It's useful for many countries except our African peers. The data for African countries is so poor that you can't really make these comparisons. So I wanted to ask Hilary and Simon to begin what they think of this table, because it does kind of present an argument that's somewhat different to the position they take in the book. And their argument in the book really is that the British have made a kind of spectacular mess of dealing with the virus, and that the reasons for that really relate to what everyone calls this, the decade or so, perhaps a little more actually, the last perhaps 20 years, neoliberalism as economic policy and austerity in particular, post 2008 austerity that left Britain particularly vulnerable. So I wanted to ask what they think about this table, and then ask all three of you to think about whether or not there is a kind of visibility problem in the discussion and the understanding of the pandemic crisis. And the visibility is, so the table, if people look at it, you can follow the link there. There's a table which you can sort by essentially deaths per population, deaths by 100,000. And what you see when you sort it in that way is that the countries that have really been hammered by the pandemic are the Eastern Bloc countries and Russia in particular. Now, of course, we don't have data for the African countries, but I suspect that we would see something similar. And yet there's virtually nothing. I mean, we've had a few news reports about Russia, about 18 months ago, but by and large, there's no reporting in the English language press or in any of the really scholarly things that I've looked at about why this is happening and what it means, whether it has political implications. So I want to ask you to talk us through that and see whether or not there is whether there's a better way perhaps we should be thinking about relative performance under these conditions.
Okay, well, Hilary's going to start us off on that.
Yeah, so I think the question says, if excess deaths are a better measure of the real cost of the crisis, and that's what this economist table is showing, that qualifies the degree of the failure that Hilary and Simon set out in their study, because it's interesting that Britain seems to have performed roughly similarly to other European countries. So I think what I really want to say here is that the key point to remember for Britain and for many other developed countries is that there were in fact two distinct phases in the pandemic. So that economist chart gives excess deaths over the whole period, the 21-month period. And so perhaps that's a bit too summary to sort of say it disproves the argument. And in our book, we very clearly document two phases. So basically the phase before the vaccination program rollout and post-vaccination rollout, which of course happened just as we were completing the book. We'd originally submitted our draft on the 31st of December, and then we updated it during the next 3 or 4 months as the vaccination rollout happened. So if you look at the chart in the Economist link, which shows cumulative total excess deaths, is preceded by a chart that shows week by week excess deaths. So the first chart that you get to, and it has darker red, the higher the excess deaths, the darker the red. And what that shows very clearly is, if you look at this first pandemic phase prior to vaccinations, that the experience in Britain during that period was close to the worst in Western Europe. So if you look at, in particular, April 2020, we had 4 weeks of excess deaths that were between 50% and 100%. We had 2 weeks where our excess deaths in Britain were over 100%. Italy didn't ever reach 100%. Germany never went above 38%. France maxed out at 62%. And Ireland, obviously very close to us, had only 37%. Spain was just as high as Britain, and so was Belgium. But in general, that period, the first few weeks of the pandemic, what the argument that I would make is that it's that period when you saw the impact of the austerity cuts, of the lack of preparedness, which wasn't just about austerity cuts, it was about general government attitude to planning, the fact that that the earlier planning work that was done after the 2016 major exercise was just set on one side, and resilience resources were put into Brexit planning, not into pandemic planning. So we had the running down of PPE, we had the running down of our capacity for testing, which was, we had to abandon testing in March 2020 and set up a whole new privatized system, which took months to come on stream. We'd got, far fewer critical care beds. We'd cut our ordinary day beds. We made this massive mistake because we'd cut 30,000 beds in the NHS, which is 1 in 6 of our entire bed capacity. We then had to discharge 25,000 what were known as bed blocking elderly patients from the NHS into care homes. And we did that with an instruction that they didn't need to be tested for COVID. And they said, no testing, no negative tests would be required. And during April, we had tens of thousands of extra deaths. So this very high excess death that you see in Britain is linked to all of these issues. Also, the fact that our lockdown was 1 or 2 weeks later than all those other European countries that I've mentioned. And of course, we had people like David King and Neil Ferguson, the modeler, saying that if we'd locked down at the time that other countries, say like France had, we may have had only half the deaths that we had in the ensuing weeks. And of course, we did things like, whereas Ireland, so Ireland has St. Patrick's Day on the 17th of March. They cancelled all St. Patrick's Day's events. They forbade parties to go ahead. We allowed the Cheltenham Racing Festival to go ahead. We allowed a whole load of Spanish fans to come over for a football match in Liverpool. We allowed these huge events to go ahead at the point at which cases are rising exponentially. So the whole set of areas in which the management of the pandemic in those early weeks is very directly reflected in the much higher levels of excess deaths that we saw in those first few months. Then we had the vaccination program, and that is when things were transformed in the UK. We rolled out the Pfizer vaccination in early December, and then AstraZeneca from the beginning of 2021. And that was a success, and one can discuss the reasons why that was a success, but our success in developing the AstraZeneca vaccination was clearly linked to historic investment in life sciences, which predated austerity, and it was rolled out by the National Health Service as one of the few bits of the pandemic response that wasn't privatized. But I think what you have to remember is that from the 8th of December 2020 to the 15th of February 2021, which was the main period of vaccination rollout when we vaccinated the 15 million most vulnerable people, 55,000 people in Britain died of COVID during those 10 weeks, which was half of the total to date. And the country remained in lockdown for months after that. So I think you really have to ask the question, yes, there were two phases, the first phase of the pandemic, the second phase post-vaccination. How much worse might things have been in Britain if we hadn't had the success of the vaccination programme, given our health capacity and our seeming inability to lock down early and fast? And I think the one other point I'd like to make about excess deaths is that we haven't got the full picture on excess deaths. We know that in the UK, hospital waiting lists are currently standing at 6 million people still waiting for a hospital appointment. There are apparently 50,000 missing cancer diagnoses that didn't get made during the pandemic. And if you have a very fragile health service that isn't able to cope with that level of treatment backlog, then we don't know what the tail of excess deaths in the future from the pandemic is going to be. Obviously, that affects other countries, but I think all of these things need to be borne in mind, given how much capacity we've lost in the NHS and our workforce crisis, our huge levels of vacancies and lack of morale in the health service.
Yeah, good
That's
answer.
my answer.
Yeah.
Well, we did have a bit where
Good defense, Your Honour.
where I would add something, but I think that was a very full answer.
Yeah, that's systematic.
And I don't want to take up time.
I think I should say Adam has to leave at the top of the hour, so I'm going to probably move. Stephen, might kick you down, if you don't mind, down to the sort of history questions. Not that Adam's not interested in those, but I think it'll be easier to keep the focus on those issues for later.
Could I add something in reaction to that first question?
Yeah, no, of course.
Which is a very interesting one. And I havered back and forth over this and decided in the end not to write the book that Hilary and Simon wrote, because I think I was worried about this particular question raising its ugly head. If we write national stories, how secure can we be? I find Hilary's defence of the position quite convincing. But I wonder whether one couldn't just go in a different direction, which is to say, well, you know what, Britain's actually just a particularly extreme case of what is in fact a very generic thing, which is a particular type of neoliberal governance across the public health sector, which is in no way confined. This isn't a British exceptionalism story, despite the bad Queen Thatcher and bad King Cameron kind of version of events. In fact, it's completely generic. And the other places where you see very high levels of excess mortality are, if you take the broader view of European history, classic austerity cases. I mean, look at the East European countries whose healthcare systems post-1990s have gone through successive shocks that suffer chronic brain drains. To Germany, for instance. Germany has overcapacity in health. That's in large part because it attracts East European health workers through the EU system. And, I don't see, if the broader argument here is, as it were, the damaging impact of neoliberal governance on the resilience of public health sectors, then in fact the data broadly confirm this. One could then argue the toss about the specific national deviations, but look at the cases. I mean, it's exactly where you'd expect. It's cash-strapped, highly unequal Latin American countries on the one hand, and cash-strapped, highly unequal East European countries on the other. I mean, and the UK in a sense just fits neatly into that, and many people are of course consistently asking that question: where does the UK post the austerity of the 80s and the Cameron era actually sit in the global comparative hierarchies? Aren't part of the right word, but the classification of state types. And there's every reason to think, on the basis of reading Hilary and Simon's book, that it fits rather neatly perhaps alongside some of the East European and Latin American cases, rather than well-organized, solidaristic, highly funded European welfare states. So, I mean, I think you could just go in that direction, take the point about excess death. I would totally sympathize with the chronological argument. I mean, mine's a book about 2020. It's not a book about 2021. And the major wave of, East European casualties comes in 2021. It's the Delta variant, really, or the second wave of the first version that really rips them to shreds. And but anyway, it's
okay,
a great. Those excess death numbers are very telling. Your point about Africa is incredibly well taken, because it poses this huge, fascinating question of either the continent is singularly invulnerable, or South Africa is an extreme outlier, or there's something wrong with the data. But
there is a problem. I mean, it's this question of the poly crisis. So Adam uses this idea that the Chinese are particularly worried about, which is it's heavily mediated crisis in which people basically prompt all sorts of political behavior basically and I wonder how that works in a context where most of the information just isn't being gathered. So if and also not being reported on, and certainly not being reported on in English. So it may be that what happens in Poland, for example, can be completely managed in a completely different way, because the media world is different.
Also, I think you can read polycrisis quite usefully as a sort of characterization of a second or third order crisis. In other words, it's the condition of becoming a headless chicken under the impact of like 7 different crises at once. That's Jean-Claude Juncker, He's not everyone's idea of the most highly competent technocrat, after all, used this phrase. And I think it described that sense that Brussels was just, it's an omnishambles. It was being dragged one direction and then the other direction, and what were they going to do? And one way of dealing with that is actually to cut down on the information flow. If you're not able to govern a problem, one way is to simply not count it, and that's presumably key to the management strategy of many African states, that know they have limited governance capacity, know frankly also that this isn't the biggest threat that they face, that there are probably 5 or 6 other things which may be even worse, or at least are willing to roll the dice on that, to say, well, you know what, maybe this is a problem for other countries but not for us. And on the basis of that, then yes, indeed, manage, as it were, the information overload problem by simply not acknowledging it, not recognizing it, not counting it, in which case, a modest surge in mortality amongst a relatively small proportionally elderly population or whatever just doesn't show up, and you move on through. I think it's perfectly, one shouldn't, polycrisis is definitely so threatening to the Chinese in part because they have the promise and the commitment to a kind of omniscience and an omnicompetence that other states just don't.
We will come back to these questions. So I think what I'm going to do now, because we'll come back to these, there's another Chinese question really, which relates to the kind of state that can implement the reforms that Hilary and Simon have got in mind. So they have in mind a whole sort of structural change to the way, especially tax and debt are managed. And we'll come back to that. I hope before Adam leaves. I think it's a really interesting problem. But so Stephen, that means you get kicked down the run of show further a little bit. And we go next to Laura's question. So are you ready, Laura? Can you jump in?
I am. Hi, everyone. I hope you can hear me. So I'll just ask this kind of shortened version of my question, which is to Adam, which is there any difference between what motivated the central bankers that you wrote about in Crashed compared to the bankers of Shutdown, many of whom I think you point out are the same people? And really the question is then, how affected have bankers and policymakers been by the dramatic political changes in the past decade? Thanks.
It's a great question. I think broadly speaking, the story that most people find compelling about this is that there's a sort of systematic process of disinhibition in which, as it were, for somebody like Bernanke, well, the contrast between the ECB and the Fed is very telling, right? That for somebody like Bernanke, it required a leap of kind of cognitive faith, but it was based on a technocratic judgment. It was time to go and to do big QE type things, and to stretch the boundary of the legal frame if necessary. And the ECB couldn't jump over its own shadow, and not until 2012 or 2011, 2012 anyway. And by contrast, this time around, there was that momentary wobble in the European case of lasted about 20 minutes, as Lagarde, as it were, stated the original position and then shrank back from its consequences. Whereas the Fed just appears to have acted in an extraordinarily disinhibited way. And arguably this was set up by the fact that they'd seen this terrifying wobble in the repo market the previous fall, and had already, both the ECB and the Fed had after all been reversing out of their position of tightening in 2019 because they realized the markets could maybe not take it. And so then when things really began to go wrong in March, there was just this move to an utterly disinhibited kind of action, and I think that's the simplest story, that this is a cumulative process, an abandonment also of the first generation. Also, I think, had an idea that there was normalization on the horizon and that you could return to normality at some point, and that's the preoccupation of the late Bernanke period and the Janet Yellen when she was chairwoman at the Fed. And I think that also has sort of drifted off out of the horizon. They are now talking, of course, about raising rates and ending QE, but no one's talking in grand terms about normalization, because that just seems fanciful. So I think that would be my first level answer to this question. And frankly, the intensity of the debate right now around the central banks, which is resumed again with real force, I think is indicative of the fact that folks feel that the whole policy discourse has become unanchored. And the intensity of the pushback you're seeing from otherwise quite well-aligned commentators like Martin Wolf at the FT, for instance, about the Bank of England and the Fed having lost touch with reality and so on. I think that's indicative of how uncertain people feel about where we've ended up. I hope the interference isn't on my line. I'm getting some sort of voices coming through. Keith,
you have to unmute.
Sorry, I've muted Carl.
Thanks,
He's
Adam.
fallen off the video, and I'm not sure. I'm sure he'll come back. He's a veteran of these things. Right, Lumkila, you're back just in time for your question.
On the same theme that Laura has raised, Adam, you highlight a new emerging market toolbox that has allowed countries like South Africa to control the macroeconomic shocks generated by the COVID crisis. But if you look more carefully, you'll notice that they are all, if not most, in a truly shocking state. Brazil, Venezuela, Argentina, Chile, Mexico, Turkey, Russia, India, and South Africa, not to mention Nigeria or Ethiopia. In the past, you remember the monetary crisis have generated domestic crisis. Isn't there a real danger now that the emerging market states will not respond to that domestic crisis because they can simply keep lights on with the market money?
This is a great question, and I was worried that the toolbox argument will be misunderstood, and I love the way that you're reading it, which is that it's really about almost a kind of schizophrenic state we find ourselves in. It reminds me a little bit of Eichengreen's argument in the Hall of Mirrors book about 2008. We're good enough now, if you like, at keeping the patient alive. there is a tool set here, and that's really a kind of two-saccharin version. There is an elite bind between money market financial elites in highly sophisticated emerging markets and their analogues in Europe and the United States and China that enables crisis management to function quite effectively and to avoid rupture, to avoid break. Part of the problem there, exactly as you say, in a sense, then the moment of crisis never arrives. So then you remain frozen in this state of managed misery, which in the case of South Africa, as you say, with regard, just the unemployment rate is, the most pivotal indicator, but you could extend that more generally, is really quite, is a very serious condition to be in. But I mean, my argument was really confined to, as it were, this limited moment. And I mean, I was a participant in it, so this was part of my own process of thinking through this. That there was alarm bells were going off all over the world in February, March, April, and the scenario that we were worried about was some sort of mega taper tantrum, capital flight, bank-driven implosion, and one has to register the fact that that didn't happen. But I agree, as you say, the next question is, well, what was the price of that potentially? I don't think we've quite seen that yet, but certainly what does that kind of crisis management enable to continue? And certainly it's not the resolution of any kind of structural problems or anything of that type. I mean, from the strictly financial macroprudential point of view, you could say the ship is now being run tighter, it's trimmer, it gets through even heavy seas. But absolutely, from the point of view of the real economy and the social impact, it's potentially absolutely, well, it's miserable. And this is after all, and this goes to the earlier conversation. I mean, it's one of the real ironies of this moment, right? Is the Mexico that you cite. It's astonishing. Like, we have this notionally left populist administration, which is implementing a fiscal policy more rigorous even than the IMF would advocate. And surprise, surprise, yes, they haven't suffered, a financial crisis. But I mean, that's the entire, AMLO is, as it were, preemptively ensuring that can't happen, but at the price of fiscal inaction in the face of immiseration.
Before Lucy, we come to you, I wanted to just lead this back to, it struck me, one of the problems with the reform measures that Hilary and Simon work on is that it's hard to find an agent for them. And it is quite possible that, you could interpret the post-2008 central bank, this ideological change, the political change, has been a kind of similar disavowal of neoliberalism. So they now regulate these banks down to a nicety. They drive them, there's no enthusiasm anymore for being a trader. Everybody's terrified of all the paperwork that comes along with doing it. So, and a lot of the kind of hotshot people that drove the Tories into this, they've been abandoned, I think. At least it seems like they have been from a distance. So the question would be, shouldn't you be looking at these central bankers as a kind of agents, in fact, for the kind of change that you're interested in implementing? And that could be, that could be partly about going after assets. That's one of the things they're most enthusiastic about, finding ways to pin assets down and turn them into something that's actually valuable in the economy. So but you kind of skirt that. You don't do what Adam's argument is, kind of this autonomous group of bankers who pretty much keeping the wheels on this very unstable vehicle, keeping them turning. But what's your view of the bankers as a potential ally in the transformation you're trying to plot?
It's interesting that Mark Carney wrote this interesting book the moment he stopped being a central banker, which was not exactly a Damascene conversion, but is very, very different from this sort of business as usual story. He clearly wants to see a lot of changes, and there are books coming out from establishment figures, like him, which are arguing that things have really got to change. I mean, if we think back to the 2008 financial crash, the main thing here in Britain was the Vickers Commission, which reported in 2011 and its report gave the banks, the commercial banks, 8 years till 2019 to, it did propose some proper reforms, but it gave them 8 years to do something about that. And I mean, we've certainly had on our television in Britain, there was a program just last night in which a trader was being interviewed, and he was sort of saying how, nothing, 2012-13 at least, nothing changed. Go for big risk was still the idea, because 2019 was way, way, way away. So I think that, it is possible that maybe we are seeing a change, but it's not a revolution of attitudes. But I think that there is a lot of movement of opinion, and I mean, our view is that the pressure is going to grow. We've just had a year of climate events that nobody can ignore. Germany, west coast of America, having things that people can't pretend are not there, and this kind of pressure that we've got to change the kind of way we're doing business and have been doing for the last 40 years is just going to grow and grow. And we've all heard of tipping points and so on, that it's very, very difficult to know exactly when there's going to be a real change of heart. But we can see Christine Lagarde and the IMF issuing statements that you would never have dreamed of hearing 4 or 5 years ago. The FT, we have this long quote from the FT, which is pretty extraordinary when you read it. Hilary might read it out a bit later. So I think that, yes, I would agree that not much has changed, or not enough, nothing like enough has changed since 2008. And nothing, and still not since during the course of COVID. But there is an accumulating weight of opinion, of views, which I think, and you've got people like Gates himself saying, interesting things. So I don't know. I mean, Adam, I thought, you're perhaps a little more pessimistic than I am, but I think that maybe these are straws in the wind, but I think they're perhaps a little bit more than that.
Well, I mean, I would add to, like Keith's set up, that for me there's dialectic, a fancy word, but there's a relationship, right, between the disempowerment of popular forces and the level of agency that we see from elite figures like Carney. So it's precisely in times when they do not have to fear that anything they might say would be taken out of context by a Corbynist, a Labour Party or whatever, that they're going to be more vocal, because then they can pose, as Mark Carney certainly likes to do, as the kind of radical chic end of the Davos set. And he's very compelling in that role. He's an extraordinarily charismatic technocrat. But he likes to be the person who does that. But that's a much more comfortable position to occupy when you don't actually have a substantial social force that might take up these ideas and do something about it. I'm not, though. I would argue that I'm not. I guess I just take this issue of agency extremely seriously, and so I am kind of I'm withholding, if you like, in offering any simple answers, because it just doesn't seem. I mean, the condition of our current moment is precisely that we're in a head-scratching moment when it comes to that question, like, well, who is supposed to deliver on this? But that doesn't leave us immobile. I mean, look at what's happened in Germany. So you need, first of all, the right people need to win the election. Party politics matters, coalition politics matters, the distribution of jobs in government matters. And so that's classic old school social forces, party politics in action. There is still a significant difference between the Social Democratic Party, even of Olaf Scholz, and the Christian Democratic Party, even of Angela Merkel. And it really matters which one of them is in power and holds the finance ministry. And then the other thing that we've seen is the effect of argument that I would pitch less at the conceptual level and more at the extremely technical level. So we are winning a fight, for instance, on output gap estimation in Europe right now. And that is an argument that's been carried on now for 2 or 3 years by a bunch of people who are just trying to name and shame the economists who produce these absurd output gap estimates. for Italy, showing that Italy is actually at full employment. It's just ludicrous. And once you've built that into your assessment of fiscal policy, you can't move. You deprive the politicians of the option of moving. So we now have the economics ministry in Berlin fully doing full naked exposure of its entire data set and the programs they're running on the data set to estimate the German output gap. And that's a real step forward, because once you've done that, you can force the EU Commission to do the same thing, and then Italy will be able to present its own data and its own assessment of its macroeconomic position. Now, this isn't revolutionary politics. This takes place within the context of the power structures of the Eurozone, but it's movement. It's something like Simon was saying, it's something we wouldn't have expected to see out of the German finance ministry 5 years ago. So that kind of leverage, those kind of combinations, but this is just spelling out what everyone involved in actually trying to change government policy already knows, right? It's a combination of social movements, public activism, actual electoral gains, ministerial positions, and nuts and bolts shifting what civil servants are asked to do and what they're encouraged to produce in terms of spreadsheets and what goes on the minister's desk. And if you can bring all of those factors together, it was 5 or something, right? You can undeniably get somewhere. That's, after all, what the other side does every single day of the week, right? Things aren't the way they are because they just are that way. Certainly in the US case, they're continuously working to rig the entire game the other way, right? And they're mobilizing exactly that same combination of forces to drive it the other direction. Because the world we're in is not just, as it were, capitalism, state of nature, it's like that because it's like that. That totally underestimates the work that the other side does every single day.
So having given people these questions, we're now shuffling them around to make life very complicated. So now we're going to jump back, because it makes sense, I think, in terms of the sequence, to Stephen's questions.
Yeah, so I mean, in a way, the first part is just, it closely relates to what's just been discussed, which is, and it's probably more for Adam than Hilary and Simon, which is there is a very, I think, still striking difference of emotional register about bailouts in the two books. I think Hilary and Simon's is they're both angry, but Hilary and Simon's is particularly so, and that might be actually because Adam has, by virtue of exploring what might have shifted or seems to be shifting, and his investment in the argument that lessons have been learned to some extent, necessarily, is a bit more pragmatic. But so I think Adam, maybe if you could just speak to that briefly. The other one is a bit sort of about, there's great time depth to Hilary and Simon's book, which I love. But this would be a good chance, I think, maybe to talk about how the national focus does kind of constrain it a little bit, in part just, again, because of the kind of book you're writing and the intervention you're making. But it speaks to the kind of the history of empire partly, and the role of debt in that Keith flags in the questions, but also how you think a way forward, and this is for the authors of both books, how you think a way forward can be charted in a context where we've been told low growth or degrowth is the only option, and where that doesn't seem viable for lots of reasons, including India, China, and the other problem, which is how do you deal with immigration from failing states or emerging markets, and the political consequences of that, and the demographic crises within the societies that you're writing about.
Sure, I'll start. I'll be as brief as I can, because this is the second time around. I just don't do moral indignation very well. I'm sorry, I just don't get there. And I think it's also in part that, in part now it's actually partly a stylized position because I'm so sick and tired of this, this jab, but also because I'm trying to actually characterize what's novel and interesting about what happened starting in the United States, which is the vantage point I write from. And I was very disappointed by Robert Brenner's first summary article on this in the New Left Review, where he talks about this as unrestrained plunder or escalating plunder or something. And that's just a really fundamentally bad characterization of the CARES Act. It just doesn't capture what's interesting and novel about that historic moment. Of course there's plunder in the American capitalist state. Like that, this is not news to anyone, nor is it surprising. right? What's surprising is when other things happen as well. And other things happened in the spring of 2020, and they're quite dramatic. And so to talk about this simply as an extension of the 2008 moment just seems to me a failure of intellectual and historical imagination. What actually shifted is really quite significant, because inside all of the tax giveaways and everything else were all of these packages which were about basically putting in place, because the American case is so much more extreme even than the world that Hilary and Simon described, right? There literally hasn't ever been a functioning national unemployment insurance system. Like Florida's unemployment insurance system is specifically designed to kick back about 70 to 80% of all applications in a normal year. Right? And so you cannot, people in Washington, on the other hand, that plays well in local Florida politics, but people in Washington know that that's not going to work as a national crisis response. So Congress has to get in on the act and dump all of this money into this essentially ad hoc non-working system. And you cannot understand the macroeconomics of 2020 and 2021 in the US unless you reckon with the fact that the disposable income of American households after tax, even at the very bottom of the income pyramid, went up. Didn't go down, despite this epic unemployment crisis. Now, that doesn't account for the psychological stress, the trauma, the devastation of people having to stand in line to apply for these checks. Obviously not, right? But you literally can't understand the macroeconomics dynamics of consumption if you assume that the story is escalating plunder and all that's going on, right? So in the book, what I try and describe is this Frankenstein hybridization of different modes of governance, which include, for sure, QE on steroids and so an explosive growth in the stock market. Absolutely, but you don't grasp what's novel about this situation unless you add this other component in, which is so well, and leads on to the rescue plan, right, of early 2021, which is, by the standards of American legislation, probably the most tight ship we've ever seen. They've never managed to give $1.9 trillion away before, with as little pork as there is attached to the rescue plan in March 2021. You have to account for that, right? And that is a learning also within the Democratic Party, which, as we all know, is a hybrid organization of East Coast and West Coast elites with a variety of other interest groups within that political vessel. But they got the necessary votes to ramrod an unusually tightly focused 1.9 trillion through, which went really heavily directed. I mean, I take advice from my most left-wing American friends who dig through and muckrake as hard as they can. It's very difficult to actually view that program as a story of escalating plunder. So I wanted to do justice to that narrative as well.
Can I push you both on this? Empire is the one thing. So debt, the success of British management of debt, I think most people would say was at least a tool of empire, and it may be the case that the British were able to manage debt because of the successes. First beating the Dutch up, and then everybody else. There are lots of countries that became heavily indebted in the 19th century that weren't able to manage it. And so the question really, and you could all speak to this, but I think it really is a Simon question: is how would Britain manage debt in a world in which it's not the dominant player in any global market, really, and in which growth itself is going to be very difficult. So you say this in the book, the big way in which we pay down that debt is through growth and or inflation. So what happens if we're looking at essentially really, really serious constraints on growth?
This is really, I think Hilary really was more expert on this, and we both were quite interested in an important history and policy paper by our colleague Duncan Needham, who, in fact, we both of us worked on editing that policy paper. And but I think, Hilary actually wrote that part of the book.
I think there are two issues here. One is growing through debt and borrowing, and that was not the proposal. The proposal you're talking about was where we said that debt as a percentage of GDP had gone up to around 100% from 80%. It was 30% before the financial crisis in Britain. It was 80% after the financial crisis. It's gone up to 100%. And what we said, looking at all of the work from Duncan Needham, is that we do not buy the argument that we have to have another period of austerity with the specific objective of paying off that debt quickly in the short term. And there's all the evidence about Reinhardt and Rogoff and all the rest of it, that it isn't necessary and we can afford the payments on it and all the rest of it. But yes, I mean, then we did say, and this is what Needham says, that growth or inflation is how you reduce the debt burden, not having austerity to pay it off in the short term. I mean, obviously we will grow and we will reduce, and we've certainly got inflation. I mean, it's not the case that we're in some kind of, trap at the moment where that debt burden is not going to come down. I think there's obviously an argument for green growth, sustainable growth. That doesn't have to be degrowth. So, I mean, I think that, it's not quite the sort of black and white dichotomy between never paying the debt off and paying it off quickly. So that would be how I would respond to that. I mean, I don't know if you want to say anything about the historic position.
Actually, just linking to the earlier question about anger. I mean, for me, one of the things that really wound me up was in 2015, when the Conservatives can finally ditch the Liberal Democrat break on them. This is 2 years after XLgate. This is 2 years, Osborne, in his Mays lecture in 2010, when he'd set out how he was going to proudly bring public expenditure right down, and he justified it because of the Reinhardt and Rogoff stuff. And then it's demonstrated that this is hooey. It's one of the all-time funny but not so funny mistakes that occurred to leading academics. And then 2 years after this has been demonstrated, 2015, he presses even harder down on the austerity thing, not giving a toss about the people whose lives he is turning into a misery. He's already been doing it. He's now doing it even more. And even, to think that Ian Duncan Smith couldn't, he resigned because he was now being asked to cut disability. He'd cut everything else. He'd been prepared to do that as a soldier of his, but even he couldn't cope with that. And Osborne is now in complete denial about this. He will not fess up to it. This was real pain and misery being imposed on a population because, initially with the justification from Reinhardt and Rogoff, and then when that disappeared, oh no, we'll just carry on. We'll just do even more of it because what we really want to do is just cut public spending because that's what we believe in.
On the empire point, though, and I think on the broader international setting, it is an interesting moment because there are multiple phases, obviously, to Britain as a fiscal actor and as a debtor in the global economy. And one of the real puzzles, and I still think it is to a degree a puzzle, is how we, because we think of, as it were, the classic 19th century era with Britain enjoying hegemonic advantage. And then we think of the period really from the mid-20s, 1920s onwards. This is where Keynes gains his entree as a period of mounting crisis, which culminates in the IMF program in the mid-1970s, right? And then, oddly, the problem goes away. Right? And by the late 1990s, you have Gordon Brown presiding over a huge surge in public expenditure with apparently no balance of payments constraint. Right? And this actually becomes a mantra. There isn't a balance of payments constraint. Britain can run these gigantic current account deficits. It's been doing it for decades now without a sterling crisis, gilt market crisis, classic, the thing which haunted every Labour government between the mid-20s and the late 70s. And the question is what's happened, right? I mean, empire is long out of the picture at this point. So the question is, as it were, what is retaining that? And you could say once upon a time there was the giant portfolio of overseas investments, which were the long-term legacy of that imperial position, or the long-term legacy of the financial special relationship with the US, which in financial terms was every bit as important, the informal North American empire. How long can this go on for is a real question, I think. And Britain is to a degree a case in point, but it is one, I think, amongst a range of other substantially indebted, rather high income countries, which you might expect to be subject to fiercer external constraints than they are. And this goes back to the question about the emerging market toolkit. And essentially, Britain is, to my mind, a highly sophisticated, high income, highly capable exponent of the toolkit. And you manage devaluation, you apply macroprudential regulation, and that's how you work your way through. And it's certainly not a guarantee, and it's certainly not the dominant hegemonic position that Britain had, nor, however, is it the eternal shadow over your shoulder, balance of payments constraint crisis, haunted regime. You know, Brexit, Brexit surely should have just spooked every conceivable market. It should have blown sterling down, the yield in gilts should have exploded. This is a country essentially shipwrecked with no visible strategy, and yet not. Right? So I mean, it's remarkable. I think it's a very interesting question, and for me, it suggests that we may be actually not quite understanding how sovereignty and the global financial system actually relate to each other at this moment. There is still some imaginative catching up to do, and that's for me that's what the intervention about the toolkit chapter was intended for in Shutdown. And what's interesting for me again is that you see people on the inside of the apparat, in the IMF, in the BIS, thinking this out loud too. They're waiting for the penny to drop or the hammer to drop somewhere, and it just isn't dropping.
Yeah, that's very interesting. A couple of thoughts on that, and these are just speculative thoughts because this is not an area that I'm any expert in at all. But one is the kind of, how does the experience of Japan relate to all this? Because, you know, if you think Britain's got problems in these terms, it seems like Japan's had them in spades for very much longer, and nobody's worrying about Japan and its economy and so on. So kind of that needs some explaining. And my second thought is a rather darker one, which is about the function of London in the world's, you know, it seems to have this extraordinary role at the center of this spider's web of basically illicit money on a very, very large scale going hither and thither to all these various secrecy jurisdictions. And, you know, as we know from the Panama Papers, quite a lot of the world's government figures are up to their necks in all this stuff. So nobody wants the British economy to go down, you know, who's powerful. They've parked massive amounts of their wealth in real estate in London. And in fact, we now hear even wider, you know, other parts of Britain as well. So it's sort of like an enormous bank, you know, and I just wonder, is this part of what's going on in your puzzle?
One of the things Britain certainly doesn't have is a lowflation problem like Japan. So to go to Hilary's point, like Britain doesn't have to grow very much in real terms to nevertheless get substantial attrition of the debt to GDP ratio. Because Britain, unlike Europe, has a positive inflation problem in a sense. The Bank of England has actually to take action to prevent inflation going to 3 or 4% per annum. From the point of view of attriting that debt, that's great, right? Because you do modest 1% per annum in real growth, you add 3% on top, you've got 4% denominator growth. All you have to do is stop the rise in the deficit to produce long-term stabilization. But I think your points about London as a safe haven and UK real estate as a preferred, you know, asset are very well taken. Japan, on the other hand, of course, also does have a gigantic trade surplus and is rapidly building its overseas portfolio, which is very unlike the UK position.
Yeah.
I'm worried we're going to lose you, and I want to get Carl's question. And I think I don't want to rush them all. Lucy, I'm going to kick you down. And this is what happens: you invite a philosopher into your seminar, and then she starts telling you the questions are not logically organized. So she goes last now. Carl, that means you're up, and you have to get them in quickly so that Adam has time to answer, and then we can have a bit more time.
Right. Okay. So very quickly. So it starts off with. Takes us back to the question of agency, which you spoke about before, Adam. And Adam, you point to the impossibility of imagining a revolutionary or radical reform happening under current conditions without organized constituencies mobilizing. On the other hand, Hilary and Simon, you put forward a radical reform, but I don't think there's a sufficient discussion about what would be the agency for that. So that's my question to you, but where does the agency come from that could mobilize around those policies? And for Adam, have you perhaps underestimated the change that might be happening? Biden's programs have been described as the end of neoliberalism in the US. And then there's the Chinese move to re-regulate financial markets and corporations, which strikes me as a kind of unexpected move. Are they perhaps signs of something more radical, more reformist than what you were thinking at the time you wrote?
I mean, we get into semantics here of what's really radical and what not. But I take your point, and I was sketching an answer earlier on, right? That in the sense that I think that it's not impossible to imagine movement. In fact, it would be naive. The whole thing is, after all, not a story of stasis versus movement. The whole thing is constantly moving. And the question is, in what direction is it moving? And I'm perfectly happy, indeed involved in, as I'm sure everyone on this call in various ways is, in various efforts in small ways to shove it in one direction rather than another. So I'm not into that story of stasis. Let me speak to the China point because it's so fascinating. I mean, it's so difficult right now. And I mean, I'm very conscious of the legacies of this on the part of Western leftists looking with kind of awe at, huge, gigantic acts of apparent state autonomy in states like China. I'm thinking about the 1930s and Stalinism, of course. But how can one not, I think, characterize the moves made by Xi Jinping's regime, largely after I finished writing the manuscript, to establish what is, to me, it's clearly a set of moves designed to ensure the continued relative autonomy of the party-led wing, if you like, of this regime. And what's really striking about it is its degree of freedom relative to really serious money and what in the West would be, as it were, entrenched and massive oligarchic power. And that is remarkable. And what's really, to my mind, incredibly telling is the profoundly ambiguous relationship that very big Western money has in relation to this project, because they simply cannot resist the growth that it generates and the opportunities they see. They also see that people do get very wealthy in China and want part of that, and they want indeed to manage those people's wealth. But on the other hand, it's also the case that Jack Ma literally, clearly, for a large part of the last 6 months is living in terror, right, of what's going to happen to him and his uncertain fate, which is something that will never, regardless of the outrageousness of Jeff Bezos's activities or whatever, that's never ever something that's going to, something that's never ever going to touch him. And so there clearly is. But I was withholding at that point because, I mean, stabilizing our judgment in relation to Xi Jinping's regime, I think, is a huge challenge and not one that, I felt really ready to pronounce on in a book or something like that. That's part, for me, one of the work I do in the newsletter is to continuously try and just figure out how we position ourselves in relation to this. And in some ways, as I was indicating, for me, the simplest way is not directly, as it were, to try and face and read what the Chinese regime is doing, but to watch other Western watchers who are much better informed and can speak, Mandarin and read Mandarin, and in the West, and how they are positioning themselves. Because in a sense, I think we have to be clear about the complexity of our position in relation to this regime and its transformation. But on the face of it, I would absolutely grant, and that's implied by the framing of the book, right? By the acknowledgement, at least, of the intellectual force of the position of some of these security intellectuals on the Chinese side in the final paragraphs, that I take that to be our challenge certainly in the West, in Europe, in the United States. And increasingly, that's a very pressing one, right? Where you line up on that debate marks out your position in the public sphere in the US, indeed also in Europe increasingly. The pressures in South Africa may be very different, and that's in itself extremely interesting, I think. Certainly in the US right now, in the EU, the China hugger label as the Putin Versteher label, these are weapons of war wielded within this kind of discourse quite freely at this point. So we're engaged, we are, I think, engaged in an open interpretive battle. I'm so sorry I have to go. I was foolish not to have remembered just how rich these conversations are. It's been an incredible pleasure again, and good to see you all. And I look forward to another occasion soon. And
Thank you, Adam. I'm going to email you, Adam. There's another Adam question in the chat. I'm going to send it to you both, and I'll copy you. Everybody.
See you, Adam. Yeah.
It's good to see you too.
Yeah.
Thanks, Adam.
Cheers.
Yeah.
So if I move on to the agency question, is that that'd be helpful? Which I think is of course, our book was really trying to hammer out some ideas about, to motivate agency, which is, with our primary aim here. But I think that to draw from them to make some observations about agency. Well, first of all, a key argument in the book, which a lot of people have picked up on as something quite novel that we've come up with, certainly seems to have, most of the reviews seem to have picked on it, is this concept of collectivist individualism. And we're arguing that these terms, collectivism and individualism, have had far too facile a run, because paradoxically they've been the property of philosophers, and principally, and of course philosophers like to make rational distinctions between things and clarify those and so on. But if you're a historian of a country like Britain, I mean, real societies, collectivism, individualism, the idea that these are somehow you get one or the other, really doesn't make an awful lot of sense. And in Britain's case, we're arguing that it really doesn't make sense, that because of the particular history of this unusual, very long-running combination of the old Poor Laws and the Charitable Uses Acts in harness together, going back to the late Elizabethan period, and the way in which they interact actually with our sort of normal demographic and family system. Britain throughout its history has been a profoundly individualist society. It's where, a lot of people think liberalism and individualism come from this British matrix, but it has been a collectivist individualism, because it's been a society which has devoted enormous attention and resources to empowering individuals through collective resources, which it has taxed itself for very, very long periods, and still even now, of course, George Osborne wanted to desperately get the tax take right down, but sure enough, we're back up to 40% plus in no time, because we're a country that believes you should support your poor. We've got a prime minister who's got into trouble with a leading footballer because he's been far too mean about it, which shows that actually, the real attitudes of the British people are, no, we should be supporting children and poor people. So from the point of view of agency, in at least Britain, we've got an enormous potential resource to draw on. We've got a profound, long-standing heritage of collectivist thinking, collectivist attitudes, collectivist values that run alongside our individualism, not opposed to it. And therefore, it's a matter of politics and presentation and messaging and so on to draw that out and to show how that is, that can work. And I would point to, in terms of our politics at the moment, there does seem to be emerging a practical anti-conservative alliance amongst voters, that the Labour Party and the Liberal Democrats have denied that they are going to go into some kind of actual electoral pact. But they've pointed out, or at least I think Rachel Reeves has, that voters are actually doing this for themselves in these by-elections. They've been concluding, how do we get the Tory out? We'll vote Labour. How do we get the Tory out? We'll vote Liberal Democrat. So I think that Labour, Liberal Democrats and Greens, who of course are still a very small party, but potentially could grow more, these these parties that stand for, you know, what the last 40 years of the Conservative Party have not stood for, they're responsible, you know, 60% of the voters are voting for them. It's just that they've always been split. The Conservatives, because of our peculiar system in England, get elected on, you know, a minority vote, and that's what they've been doing. And then I think finally, in terms of agency, and a point I would make is that, you know, sadly, you know, not whether any of us wish it, I'm quite convinced, as the final cartoon in our book sort of graphically illustrates, you know, we're facing a century of repeated and increasing crises of many kinds. You know, the COVID microbe is part of the environmental crisis we've created through, you know, too much growth and energy usage and so on. There's going to be more and more of this. Well, crises do produce collectivism. I mean, unfortunately, they can produce the form of collectivism that results in xenophobia and defensive nationalism as well. But they do produce collectivism. They're not good news for outright individualism and, you know, kind of the wealthy looking after themselves. And I think that, you know, so that there are a number of reasons why I think, at least from the point of view of Britain's history, which is what our book was about, to see that there are, you know, reasons why we can look forward, why, you know, agency is there, if agency has the ideas, if it has the motivations.
So I think we can go in two directions. We can go towards the difficulties of the political reform, or we could think about Omicron as and let's pretend we're Latourian for a minute and think about whether, so Lucy, would you like to pursue that? And then we'll come back to these. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks. So it's just a question about how the things you proposed, the things that worked and the reforms that you've proposed interact with the new characteristics of Omicron. And so in particular, its ability to affect the vaccinated. And we were going to ask Adam about whether this will weaken or strengthen Chinese geopolitical momentum and domestic control. So don't know if you have thoughts about that, but just generally about whether features of the analysis, how they interact with Omicron.
Well, I mean, I think there's a whole set of issues here. I mean, Omicron in the UK is perceived now to be relatively mild, and I mean, yes, it gets through vaccines, but the whole sort of argument is that all the people in hospital from Omicron are unvaccinated. So the vaccinated people are not getting ill very significantly in significant numbers, even though they may be catching it. So I'm not sure that Omicron is a game changer. Actually, I think that what may be a game changer is a much more severe mutation that also sidesteps vaccines, and that is a huge danger, and what we need to do is to make sure that we minimize the risk of further mutations by making sure that we're pursuing a global vaccination program, and that all countries are getting access to those vaccines.
Yes, I mean, Gordon Brown has been getting very frustrated by this lack of attention to vaccinating the globe, and Michael Marmot, in the review that he's just published in the Lancet of both of these two books we're discussing today, he points out that I think the estimate is 25 billion to vaccinate the whole world, and when you look at George Bezos spending $5.5 billion to put a rocket up into space, ridiculous vanity project. It's not as if that kind of money is too hard to find. But of course, what Michael Marmot also pointed out was that the entire budget of the WHO, which of course we hear a lot about, and it is in the lead in all this, its entire budget is 4 billion, which he says is less. I think he said it's less than the budget of New York State's health department or something. And this is the organization that's supposed to be, saving the world and so on. I mean, it's crackers, the kind of, after 40 years of neoliberalism and running away from sort of universal primary healthcare and things like that, we're in this situation where, I mean, back in 1978, the Alma Ata Declaration, the world looked like it was really moving towards universal healthcare and then along comes Reagan and Thatcher and so on, and neoliberalism, and we rush off, and the World Bank and the IMF rushes off in a completely different direction. But we were bloody close in that. It's a real shame for a historian when you look at what was going on in the 70s in thinking in the WHO when it was in its pomp and so on. We were getting, there was something really good about to happen, and it got strangled. And instead we had we had selective primary healthcare instead of universal primary healthcare, and we had user fees, and then of course within 5 years HIV/AIDS was discovered. It had actually already been there in Africa, we now know, but it was discovered. So we cut all this back at completely the wrong time, certainly for the African continent. Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a lot of, the one big take-home lesson from our book, if you like, for this kind of area that we're talking about now is, build yourself a universal welfare state now, before the next crisis occurs. And, it was called, in the late 70s, they were building a universal primary healthcare system. Well, that would have been quite close to, it wouldn't have been far off at a universal welfare state if it had been done, in a well-resourced way. So, and I know that we there is a lot of movement for social protection programs around the world. And I think I would just say, well, for God's sake, ramp them up as soon as you can. If you're a poor country, invest in it, do it. Because, that has been that without that universal primary healthcare system, the costs of delivering vaccination has been part of the problem of I mean, it's partly been, it's not just about rich countries being selfish and not caring. Because of the absence of universal primary healthcare systems in large parts of the world, I think, there's been quite a lot of problem with people getting their heads around about how you actually deliver all these vaccinations into, tiny little villages, not even at the end of a track, just sort of with no road to them at all.
This is where, if I may come in here, Keith, this is where the rubber hits the road, I think, from our perspective, because we have a proposal for a national health insurance system at the moment that's been kind of around for a while, and it's marvelous. The problem is that implementing it is going to be, it's not so much how much it would cost, it's more that, the ruling party and the bureaucracy that would implement it have done little to inspire confidence, which takes us back to one of my questions, which was about, what in your story what lessons are there for us in your story? I think there are many, but part of the difficulty is it also feels like a bit of a special path that you're describing, and that's not quite our path. In fact, the continent as a whole has had a very different one. I mean, the work that you and Keith have done on registration, I think it would have been bloody nice if we had the kind of close record keeping of parishes in the 16th century, and we don't, and that's partly constrained our history or placed us in there's a sort of path dependency, is what I'm saying, I suppose, which doesn't mean we shouldn't try to build good things and progressive institutions and systems, but that there are all sorts of ways in which extroversion and the weakness of the state in the post-colony on the continent, it places us in a difficult and depressing place. You don't have to answer that. That's just, while reading this, it's hard not to think about these problems.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I mean, it is also, England does have this history of this interaction between the collective parish and the nuclear family. And I think certainly indigenous African populations they don't tend to have a nuclear family type inheritance to draw from. They've looked after their elderly and their vulnerable in a different way rather than the entire collectivity. I think that's right. I may be wrong there. I'm not an expert on the anthropology of how social security works in indigenous communities, and so it does mean that you would be bringing something different in to the poorest indigenous communities, or you might be, but that, I guess, relates to how the incentives and how you sell this I mean, if people realize that this is something that's going to give them real security, and their elderly people and their children and their ill people, and when they get unemployed, it's hard to see resistance to that if it's presented in that way.
I don't think we should push this too far in the direction of the viability of the South African welfare state. I mean, the argument is that the state pours money basically into the middle quintile, so that there's huge investment in teachers and nurses and doctors, but that means that the bottom get nothing, and it's very hard to get performance from the well-resourced middle. So the welfare state is a much trickier problem for us, and a lot of that, I think, what people would say is because colonialism designed a system of shipping human capital and resources and building institutions in the metropole and not in the colonies. But that, I don't think let's not get into that. I think that's an interesting argument for another time. I want to go back to this question of how the politics works in your story, and especially these two things that you describe, which is the money's in mortgages. Not mortgages, it's in properties. Whatever it is, £1 trillion in 810 billion pounds in unearned properties. So we have to go after this money. And then it's in pensions, another group. But this seems to me politically a nightmare, because there's nobody in Britain who doesn't think or believe or isn't actually a direct beneficiary of one of those two pots, or probably both. They either think they are, or they will get some from an aunt or a mother, or and what you suggest is there needs to be a sort of strike the state needs to intervene to go after these pools of money, which we could see the Chinese doing. I mean, it's more or less what they have done with these big finance companies. They've literally sort of said, we're going to cut your head off. And without a judicial system, you can, and when everyone's terrified of it, you can. But how could that ever work in Britain?
I'll take this one.
Yeah.
I mean, this relates to the chapter where there is the discussion of a wealth tax and other ways of tapping into wealth. So, I mean, the argument is, and it rests on this initial presentation, that the stock of private wealth as a percentage of GDP has grown from 3 times the size of our national income in the 1970s to 7 times before the pandemic, and it's grown even more since then. So the argument is, we can raise taxes in a different way than the way that Rishi Sunak is currently doing, which is to freeze personal tax allowances and raise national insurance. So, pushing tax down onto working people. The wealth tax argument was an illustrative argument, but there were many other potential proposals for how you could raise a lot of tax without going after ordinary people. So, I mean, you refer to the corporation tax, which is going to be raised from 19% to 25%. But I mean, when the Conservatives came into office, it was 28%. And that raises each one percentage point on corporation tax raises 3 billion a year. So, you know, we could go back to 28% corporation tax, you know, which would take us back to where we were and take us back to the OECD average. We could now do what Margaret Thatcher did in the 1980s, which is impose a windfall tax on you know, windfall gains. And there were a lot of windfall gains during the pandemic on businesses, you know, businesses that benefited from you know, the home shopping, home delivery, from Zoom, you know, from online, you know, online platforms and all the rest of it. We could impose a windfall tax on them. We could impose a windfall tax on all the people who experience massive increases in the value of their assets. And there's something came out recently saying that UK billionaires increased their portfolios during the pandemic by 22%, and their portfolios went up to 597 billion. Now, you know, that you could tax that. I mean, obviously there's the issue of what do you do to stop them, you know, sending it over to Singapore. But I mean, you know, the point is windfall taxes. There's a proposal now from Ed Miliband that there should be a windfall tax on wholesale gas companies who are simply profiteering from gas stocks that they had before the rise in gas prices that they're now selling at super profits to the gas retail sector. And there's a lot of proposals that we could defray the cost of living crisis in energy prices, which this is quite a domestic issue, so I don't know how much you're aware of that. But you know, there are all sorts of things you could do. The most commonly raised proposal is to align the way that capital gains are taxed, so that the tax on capital gains is the same as the tax on income tax. And it's been shown that that would raise more than enough to not have put national insurance up in April. You know, there's all sorts of other things. The wealth tax example was actually an example for a one-off tax, not a continuing tax, and it was a 5% tax on wealth holdings over 500,000, so over $1 million for a couple. And there are other proposals that have been made for wealth taxes at a much higher threshold of wealth. So I mean, I think one-off taxes, obviously, as taxes, have the big benefit that if you don't announce them until very late, people don't have time to move their assets, and also they don't have the same incentive if it's only a one-off. So that can, you know, it's been argued that that is a better form of wealth tax, and it can be presented as a kind of patriotic, you know, crisis move. So, I mean, I suppose I don't totally agree with the premise that it would be too hard to do. And you know, that there is such an accumulation of wealth, and Simon will say something in a minute, but there are a lot of actual movements in the UK from really quite surprising quarters now arguing for that to happen. I think you were going to say something about the acceptability of tax rises. It's right at the beginning.
Yes. So yeah, that's right. So this was something I've been thinking about recently. It's not in the book, well, only implicitly, I suppose. That the issue of taxation in a democracy is, of course, a pretty complex matter. But you know, I think that we have to recognise that there is a way of presenting it and actually implementing it, which can make tax more unpopular, and there are ways of doing it that can make it more popular, all to do with issues of fairness and so on. And actually we do talk about this in the book. And you know, I'm struck by the point that having progressive taxation, which reaches up to really quite high rates on the top marginal amounts, you know, right up to 80, 90% on extremely, you know, very, very high incomes. The argument that's put about is, oh, you know, that's pointless because you don't get much money. There's only a small number of people there, so it's not going to bring in much money. That really is not the point about these very high rates. The very high rates are there pour encourager les autres. They're there so that people who are paying 70%, people who are paying 60%, people who are paying 50% are feeling that this is fair. Yeah, okay, I'm being taxed at 50, but that guy, you know, who's earning twice as much as me, they're having to pay 60, 70 on that extra amount they're doing. And so you can construct a taxation system. This is a very elementary example. You can construct a taxation system in such a way that it has scales of fairness built into it, and you can then market it in that way. You can sell it to your nation as fair and just, or, which is what we've had for the last 40 years and what the Conservative Party absolutely instinctively know, is if you keep your national taxation system as regressive as you dare, you can make it generally unpopular. You know, make sure it bites the poor as well as everybody else, and it's generally and then you can have popular newspaper articles about, you know, casually saying how, of course, nobody wants to pay tax, and, you know, we all like to, you know, and you can generate this entire culture of anti-tax, of taxes unpleasant, taxes unpopular, nobody wants it. So I think that the whole thing about tax is that, you know, and also, of course, you know, how much resources are you putting into your tax evasion and tax avoidance infrastructure? The Conservatives will put very little in, and nothing better for them than stories about people evading and avoiding, because it corrodes the whole idea that you should be paying tax if you don't believe in it. So I think that what has not been addressed at all, but well, not remotely enough in the sort of those who would want to see a more social and caring society constructed, is the importance of addressing what, you know, how tax feels to people, what it looks like, how it's constructed, and whether you can sell it as a fair and a just contribution to your society, rather than some kind of imposition going back to medieval monarchs, sort of, you know, gouging sort of their noble retainers, you know. And so I think that there's a really, really important subject around this. And I've got the PhD student who completed most recently has done some fantastic work on popular attitudes to taxation, demonstrating that an entire mythology has been created about how taxes became unpopular, and that helped Mrs. Thatcher get into power, and then she brought them down, and then she became more popular. There is absolutely no contemporary evidence from the 70s and 80s to support this at all. It's a retrospective, you know, piece of historiographical revisionism created actually by journalists, as far as she could see, you know, which historians, unfortunately, Martin Daunton, who's, you know, leading historian of the history of tax, was her external examiner, and, you know, his report, you know, just said, I put my hands up, I fell for this too in my books, you know, but you know, she's demonstrated the evidence is not there. So I think this whole business about the, you know, the left needs to focus on tax and how it's presented as a really serious issue. It's a really, really serious matter, because if you can't, you know, if you can't feel good about the tax system, you're not going to be able to do anything with your country.
And I would now add to that. I mean, there was an article in the Guardian on Monday which is very interesting. It does suggest, you know, that maybe we are approaching a tipping point where this tax issue has gone too far. So I'm just quoting now from the Guardian article, highlighting disquiet in Tory ranks over the looming national insurance rise. A report from Bright Blue, which is a centre-right think tank, has called for higher taxes on capital, inheritance and rents as a way of making the system fairer and less burdensome for employers, of course. And they talk about applying the national insurance levy to pensioner and rental income, which it doesn't apply to, reforming inheritance tax, narrowing this gap between capital gains and income tax. So, you know, it's very interesting. And then you have this organization, the Patriotic Millionaires, who are actually saying they're writing to governments saying, please tax us now to tackle the gulf between the rich and the poor. I mean, obviously, you know, they're highly visible, but I mean, you know, the arguments they're making are quite powerful, and the amounts of money that they're claiming could be raised from wealth taxation and what that could actually do is you know, is extraordinary. And I just think that it's very interesting that there is this bubbling up of alternative views.
Yeah, it is also interesting. I was surprised that you didn't say more about the secrecy jurisdictions and offshoring in your book, and because that does seem to me I mean, Glenn's got a comment here in the chat saying, you know, without a global convention or set of rules, and especially about the secrecy jurisdictions, it's going to be impossible to do this. And that's really the burden that we face, is that, you know, South Africa, I think, has been relatively untouched compared to the other African countries. I mean, recently it's been bad, but the apartheid state was very fierce about controlling offshoring. But most African countries have faced a terrible continuous flow.
I think secrecy jurisdictions are, you know, they're a complete poison to democracies. And I think that, again, there's one has to begin to kind of scratch at the interests that are benefiting from them, because they're not, unfortunately, just the obvious. My strong suspicion is that the secret services of all the world's democracies are using these things for their business, and at the highest levels, governments know this. You know, I think that it's quite a hydra, but it's definitely very bad news and needs to be addressed, and if it, you know, massively reduced if you can't actually eliminate. And again, we come back to, you know, London seems to be the great facilitator. The law firms in London seem to be a real big issue here.
Yes. Okay, we won't go any further with that right now. Right, I think we're going to close, if you don't mind. I think we've done well, and it's late, it's after dinner here. So just for me to say, you know, thanks to Adam, he's not here anymore. Thanks for his contribution and engagement with us. And thanks so much, Hilary and Simon, for participating in this and giving us an opportunity to give you a hard time and learn so much from doing that. It was really very productive and useful and interesting.
Right. Well,
so I hope everybody goes out to Exclusive Books and buys a hard copy. You can also get this book as a Kindle copy. It is really a delightful, smooth, easy read. It's not, you know, there are moments in this discussion where it's got very technical, but the book itself is actually really clear. So I encourage people to go out and buy it. Thank you all.
Lovely. Thank you very
Thanks,
much.
guys. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Everybody.
Bye.
Thank you.
don't go off.